So we have a great session now, which I really want to whet your appetite for that lunch. And we're going to look at the intersection of disability and gender between ableism and sexism. So my job today is to introduce the three speakers here today, and then I'll kind of deal with the questions and answers. So I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Lucy-Anne Buckley. Lucy is the Vice Dean for Teaching and Learning in the College of Business, Public Policy and Law. She's also the Associate Head of Teaching and Learning in the School of Law, where she lectures on equality law, labour law and equity. And Lucy was also the previous Director of the LLM in International and Comparative Disability Law and Policy. She specialises in equality law and paying particular interest to the issue of gender and disability, and also the issue of family property. So I'm going just very briefly to introduce. She's also working at the moment on a project to introduce equality law more broadly into the states of Guernsey. So Lucy is going to facilitate this session today. And then I'd like to introduce Stephanie Ortaleva. And I'm hoping that all my pronunciations are correct. Please feel free to correct me. Okay, thank you. So Stephanie Ortaleva is the founding President and Executive Director of Women Enabled International. This is a non-profit organisation which works at the intersection of women's rights and disability rights, and educates and advocates internationally and regionally for human rights of women and girls with disabilities through collaboration with the Organisation of Disabled Women Worldwide. WEI, or Women Enabled International, is recognised as an innovative and groundbreaking and serves as a prime resource for disabled women activists globally. Stephanie brings the development, academic and legal perspectives to her work, as well as her personal experience as a woman with a disability. And again, we're very, very pleased to have Stephanie here with us today. And finally, and by no means last but not least, I'd like to introduce Melissa. So Melissa is a human rights lawyer and a women's rights advocate who has spent 2 decades advocating for the recognition and fulfilment of women's rights through the use of national, regional, international mechanisms. She has led fact-finding missions, she has undertaken strategic litigation, she has built the capacity of civil society organisations and published numerous articles and reports and advised governments. She is a fellow in the University of Toronto, and she works particularly in the law faculty's International Reproductive and Sexual Health Law programme, and currently is a Senior Director of the Programme of Global Advocacy at that centre. I think that we're very, very fortunate to have such 3 eminent speakers here today, and I hope you all enjoyed this particular session. So Stephanie is going to speak first, then Melissa second, and then Lucy will facilitate the entire conversation. But first, Lucy is going to introduce the topic in more detail.
Okay, thank you very much, Siobhan, for that kind introduction. Today's session, or this particular session, is focusing on women with disabilities. And just by way of background to this, and you've done a lot, I think, already in the summer school on intersectionality, but the specific section that, or article of the Convention that lies behind the discussion today is Article 6 on women with disabilities. And I suppose when we look at Article 6, it's very striking how brief it is. It's just 2 short paragraphs, okay? And a very important 2 short paragraphs where states parties recognise that women and girls with disabilities are subject to multiple discrimination, and in this regard shall take measures to ensure the full and equal enjoyment by them of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So that's our first paragraph. And then secondly, state parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure the full development, advancement and empowerment of women for the purpose of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms set out in the Convention. So 2 short paragraphs, but actually a world of meaning in there. And a very important 2 short paragraphs because, of course, Article 6 is a cross-cutting article which will affect the interpretation of all the other articles in the Convention, and also is something, therefore, that states have to take into account when they seek to develop policies or take measures to implement the other articles of the Convention. I think there's a very striking contrast between the brevity of Article 6 itself and the general comment number 3 on Article 6, which runs to about 17 pages. and explains in great detail what Article 6 actually means in practice and how it applies to the other articles and the sorts of areas of life that it touches on. And the general comment highlights a whole range of issues. We will not be touching on all of these today, but for example, it's talking about the prevalence of multiple discrimination and intersectionality, obviously as it affects women and girls with disabilities specifically. But it also talks about things like the persistence of violence against women with disabilities. That includes sexual violence and abuse, but it goes far beyond that in its definition of what actually amounts to violence. So it can be as simple as taking someone's accessibility away, and that can be a form of violence. It also covers things like forced sterilisation and reproductive rights. It covers things like sexual and economic exploitation. It covers things like the participation of women with disabilities, both in society in general and in policy making and decision-making processes. And it talks about the need for a disability rights perspective in policies that promote gender equality generally, and the kinds of specific measures that might be useful in obtaining gender equality, or that gender equality needs to consider to incorporate the experiences of women with disabilities. So as I say, we're not going to talk about all of these in one short session. I'm just flagging some of the issues that we are going to be addressing in this talk. The other issue I want to flag very much at the outset, and it's something that is strongly highlighted in the general comment on Article 6, is that when we're talking about women with disabilities, this is not a homogeneous group, okay? So if we're talking in this session about women with disabilities, we need to start by asking which women and which disabilities, okay? So bearing in mind here that the experiences of women will be very different depending on things like race, sexual orientation, religion, cultural location, whether they are urban or rural, for example, on their age, whether they are members of an indigenous group, for example, and many other factors such as that. So all of those factors are going to be at play. And likewise, we also have to consider the different types of disabilities that might affect people. So again, the experience of someone with an intellectual disability or a psychosocial disability or a physical impairment of some kind may be very, very different. Okay, so that is something that in this particular session, although we are speaking generally and we're going to be touching on a number of broad themes, we do need to consider the extent to which those experiences must also be viewed through the lens of a particular experience of a person in a particular location with a particular disability and in a particular cultural context. With that in mind, I am pleased, very pleased indeed, that we have Melissa and Stephanie to speak to us here today. And they're going to start out by, in turn, giving us a broad outline of their own particular experience and background as it relates to equality for women and equality for women with disabilities specifically, and the kinds of issues that they have been dealing with and the various ways in which they have been dealing with those issues and the particular fora and so on that they are either developing or are part of. And each of them will therefore talk for maybe 5 to 10 minutes just to give you background of where they are coming from. And we're then going to open up a more general conversation on intersectionality as it affects women with disabilities, looking at the kinds of connections and divergences that exist between the disability movement and the women's movements. And of course there are many, many women's movements and many disability movements within those parameters. But specifically, we want to focus on how the movements can work together. And, how can we go forward from here? Are there things that we can learn from one another? Are there ways that we can support one another in the achievement of mutual goals and objectives? And I think that is the the key point really of this talk, that we're going to focus on concrete and practical examples perhaps, and things that we can learn that will all support the development of both movements in these areas. So without further ado, I'm going to start by handing over to Stephanie, who's going to give us 5 to 10 minutes on her particular background. So thank you very much, Stephanie.
Good morning, everyone. Am I coming through loudly enough? Great, great. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful that at least a bit ago it was sunny here in Ireland, so that's good news as opposed to the torrents of rain yesterday. But it's really a pleasure to be here. I've read so much about the program that's taught here, and also this particular summer school program. So it's a special delight, of course, to be here with Melissa. So I founded Women Enabled International some years ago, and the reason why I founded this organization is that I had worked as a lawyer at the U.S. Department of State in the area of human rights, and I would find that one day I would work on women's issues, maybe the Commission on the Status of Women or something like that. And then another day I might work on a disability issue, like especially the follow-up on the negotiations of the disability treaty. But somehow or another, the two paths rarely crossed at all in some of the discussions. And so when I left the State Department, when we had our first, or second female, or third, I guess, female Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. I was there for a bit in her term. But when I left, I founded this organization, and it was kind of just me, but just trying to push that envelope forth, mostly in the areas, at that point, in the areas of women, peace, and security, and the inclusion of issues concerning disabled women and girls in conflict settings. Since that time, we have grown to a staff of about 10. So there are 4 of us lawyers and other people as well involved in our work. So one of our main projects has been advocacy before various UN mechanisms, including mechanisms like the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and Practice, but also all of the various treaty bodies, and also with what's called the Universal Periodic Review process, which is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council, the entity that the US has just withdrawn from yesterday. Don't blame me, it was not my idea. Yes, I often tell people I come from Canada. But anyway, I diverge. So one of our primary projects is what we call our accountability toolkit. And my partner Frank has a limited number of flyers about this toolkit, but essentially it's a series of briefing papers about advocacy before the United Nations. And we also include an analysis of how the various UN mechanisms address 2 substantive issues at this stage, one being sexual and reproductive health, and the second one being gender-based and sexual violence, and how the different treaty bodies have come up with conclusions, including observations or general comments. So the important aspect of this toolkit, and one of the themes that it represents, is that issues of women with disabilities are not only advocated before and dealt with by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its monitoring body, but actually all of the treaty bodies, all of the treaties can be used by activists to address the rights of women and girls with disabilities. Just for example, the most obvious example that everyone thinks of course, is CEDAW, the Women's Treaty, but also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has very important ramifications for the lives of women and girls with disabilities, as well as the Convention Against Torture. So what we do is we work with partners around the world. Earlier I saw a couple of people that we have done shadow reports with here. So we work with partners in an effort to bring issues in their countries to the attention of these treaty bodies and other mechanisms that work on human rights. So the importance of doing this is that when you start off working in raising the issues before one treaty body, as you move on to another treaty body, you can amplify the importance of that work. So for example, if you get a strong concluding observation from the concluding observations, for those of you who don't know, are basically the findings that treaty bodies issue after a government has reported to it. So every country which ratifies a treaty has an obligation to report to a treaty body. So if you get a strong concluding observation from the CRPD committee, and then a bit later that same government comes before, say, the CDOC committee, you can use that concluding observation to advocate more strongly and perhaps push the envelope a bit in terms of the issue to get stronger coverage. This is how we make human rights law. But it's not only that static written document. Once we have these strong concluding observations, we need to advocate in our countries to actually bring those to life. So for example, if we get a concluding observation against a particular country that practices of forced non-consensual sterilization of disabled women amount to torture, it's all very nice if that's written down on paper, but we need to then take that finding and bring it home to our countries and advocate to our legislators in our country and our governments or the courts in our country to end that practice consistent with that concluding observation. Well, all right. We got to get together and do some shadow reporting. But another really important part of the work of Women Enabled International. Remember, in my introduction here, it was said that Women Enabled International, which we call WEI because it's shorter, WEI works at the intersection of women's rights and disability rights. So not only in terms of human rights law, but also while we engage with disabled women's organizations around the world, we also engage with women's rights organizations around the world, the whole multiplicity of women's rights organizations. For example, we have done collaborative work with the Center for Reproductive Rights on advocacy around the Zika crisis that was hitting South America, and some of the language that was used in relation to disability issues. So how can we have an intersectional women's rights and reproductive rights and disability rights approach to those issues, both in terms of sexual and reproductive health matters, but also in terms of really important language issues. So we think, we believe it's very important that our movements work together, find the commonalities, recognize the differences and any perhaps disagreements, but mainly come to understanding and an effort to engage in cross-cutting advocacy around the world. We also have a few other things that we do to contribute to that effort. For example, on our website, we have what we call our global map, and it's a clickable map. So if you click on a country, you can see the various disabled women's rights organizations in that country, women's rights organizations that are interested in the issues, perhaps funders who have funded some work on these matters, academicians, etc. And while you may be asking, well, a clickable map is not really accessible to blind people, which is sure true. I can't use our map, but we also have Word documents that are appendices that give you all the same information that you can get on clicking on the map. So why do we have this map? Okay, it's pretty. It's purple. I guess you all here like purple, it seems. But it's also a really valuable resource because if a development actor, and I've come to many of these situations where someone involved in development in a country, oh, we would love to include disabled women, but I don't have any idea how to find them. Well, now you have no excuse because you can just simply go on our map and if you know of an organization that is not on that map, you just tell me, please, and we'll make sure it gets up there because we're really excited to do that. I think probably my time is about up. Oh, okay. Well, I can obviously keep going on. So that's an important thing that we do. The other thing is we have started a few years ago holding convenings. The first one was in Geneva, and it was a general convening for women from different parts of the world. But now we're doing convenings that are focusing on regions. So our second convening was held in Costa Rica last summer for Latin America and the Caribbean. And the next one will be held in South Africa to cover the Africa region. And then we're also going to do one in the spring in South Asia at a soon-to-be-determined country. But the purpose of these convenings, the purposes of these convenings are multiple. First of all, we do training on this accountability toolkit that I mentioned and how to do advocacy. But it's also a mechanism where disabled women's rights advocates can get together and think about and discuss what are some of the regional approaches that can make a difference. How can they work together within their region? What are the unique questions confronting disabled women in their region? And we also always invite a few women's rights advocates to be part of these convenings in an effort to do the important work of building alliances between disabled women rights advocates and women's rights advocates in the region. And we also have sessions that are led by participants as well as by our team as well. And bringing in South Africa, for example, we'll be bringing in some people from the university there. So we try to make these very dynamic and very interactive and very, very participatory. And hopefully at the end, people will form a sisterhood and a community, but also engage in activism. And from these convenings and other work, we partner with disabled women's organizations around the world to prepare these so-called shadow letters or submissions to the different treaty bodies. And we have had the pleasure of doing a submission to Melissa's working group when the working group visited the United States some years ago. We did do a submission on women and girls with disabilities and the issues confronting them. And we've also done some submissions on some of the thematic reports that the working group has done. So one of the things that makes me very happy about being here is getting to know Melissa better on a personal level, which hopefully will, because the personal is political, but the personal also helps to spur collaboration, cooperation. So I'm hoping through this session that we'll be able to figure out ways to work together much more in the future and collaborate and move the rights of all women forward. And as I always say, remember, women and girls with disabilities are women too.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Stephanie, for your presentation, all your kind remarks, and Lucy as well, and Siobhan too. I'm delighted to be here at this summer school and to meet all of you. Delighted to be in your beautiful country. The topic that I've been invited to sort of talk about today, and the capacity in which I am here, is really as a member of the working group on discrimination against women in law and in practice. And I know that's a mouthful, so I'm just going to say working group. But before getting into the substance of my presentation, I think I'd like to say a few words about the working group, because it's actually, I think it's done a great deal of work. I just joined it in November, so I can say this without bias, I guess, or being blamed of being biased. But it has done an incredible amount of work within the human rights system in the short period of time that it's been around. But the work is not that well known because, for whatever reason, it just has not been disseminated. So I'm hoping that this will be an opportunity for me to tell you a little bit about the working group, and that you will be encouraged then to sort of, look into the work that it's done and think about how you can integrate some of that into your own academic research or advocacy or policy work, or, other things that you do. So the working group is actually, it's a special procedure created by the Human Rights Council. I'm sure you've heard of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's actually one of around 55 special procedures that has been created over the years. It's one of two that focuses specifically on women's rights: the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and this working group. The working group is comprised of 5 individuals, which is why we're referred to as a working group and not just a special rapporteur. But our functions are very similar. This mandate was established in 2010 by the Human Rights Council after determining that not enough had been done to really address discrimination against women globally. After recognizing that existing mechanisms, whether they be treaty monitoring bodies or other mandates, had not been able to do enough. So it was a step that was taken to sort of address that gap. When it was actually formed, there were a lot of questions about whether this mandate was necessary because there could be duplication. Clearly there were many people who felt like discrimination was not really, I guess, that much of a problem that requires a dedicated mandate. So there were some challenges. So it's in that environment that the working group actually came into being, and it's constantly been in a position where it sort of really had to establish why it's important and what it is that it does. And I think that does reflect in its work and in its choice of thematic issues over the first few years, where it decided, my predecessors in the working group decided that they would focus on a series of thematic issues that touch all aspects of women's lives, and that they would take a cross-cutting approach, which meant that women with disabilities has always been very much part of the analysis. So the first, I'll talk a little bit about the different thematic reports, but I really just wanted to make the point that they have taken a very cross-cutting and intersectional approach, and the working group does recognize that women are not a monolithic group. It's one word, but the word women represents women in so many different circumstances and situations where their lives may be affected, disadvantage may be created based on so many different things, whether it be, again, age, marital status, geographic location, race, caste, sexual orientation. There are multiple factors. So we have a very broad mandate in the sense that we have the ability to look at issues that pertain to women in many different circumstances, and also to look at where discrimination may be exacerbated due to the existence of more than one of these factors. So with that, I'm going to talk more specifically about what we've done. The working group was, the mandate itself was established in 2010, but it really came out with its first report in 2012. And what it does is its role is really to identify, promote, and exchange views on good practices relating to the elimination of discrimination against women, both in law as well as in practice. It has the role of developing a dialogue with states and other actors regarding discriminatory laws and practices, and it can also make recommendations. So we do analysis, we also make recommendations, we also attempt to hold states accountable by playing a monitoring role, and we also intervene in specific cases of discrimination. Our ability to engage with states is not subject to their ratification of a particular human rights treaty. In fact, that's something which also makes our mandate very broad. And with regards to how we operate, we often cross-reference the concluding observations and multiple treaties, concluding observations, and even the work of other special rapporteurs. So it's very broad in that sense too. A lot of our work is shaped by what we hear from individuals, from women, from civil society, and from governments. In order to fulfill our mandate, we are required to submit one annual report a year to the Human Rights Council, and oftentimes language is drawn from our thematic reports and that they make their way into actual resolutions of the Human Rights Council. So that's one way in which we're really able to influence norms and norm building. We get to undertake 2 to 3 country visits per year to really examine whether women's rights are being recognized by states and whether they're being enforced, and also to identify gaps and good practices. I think the piece about good practices and promising practices is very, very important, because as we think about how to promote accountability and engage constructively with states, it's very important to be able to point out not just where they're failing, but also where they're doing something good that can be replicated elsewhere. We also have the ability to formally contact governments and directly through communications to inquire about specific situations that may be brought to our attention by a credible source. We're often informed by NGOs about situations on the ground, and if we feel confident that an intervention on our part will not jeopardize the lives of individuals on the ground, we do write to a government and ask about the situation. We've made inquiries through communications about, for example, human rights defenders being arrested, about bad laws that are being considered by Parliament, or bills that are about to be passed. So we are able to intervene in a range of situations, and we can also issue a press release or make a public statement where the situation is very time sensitive. As well. So it really does help. Sometimes it's really important to put political pressure on a government and put a government on the spot. A recent example was in the case of Argentina, where we sent a letter to the government right before the vote by Congress on whether regarding abortion law reform, and that was disseminated very widely to parliamentarians. The message was, if you vote for law reform, you will be in compliance with international human rights norms. And sometimes that is something that people on the ground need to hear. And then we also produce position papers on issues where there are misconceptions or gaps. We are often asked to do that, to clarify international norms and standards, and also to help build new ones. And we've done that on a range of issues, including nationality, land rights, adultery, and sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on women's autonomous decision-making. Now, that's just the gist of what we do, and OHCHR's website does have all of our reports. So for anyone who's interested, you can go on their website and look up the working group and actually access our reports and read them. And I would encourage you to do so, because I think it can also give you new ideas and new ways to think about integrating what has been said about international law. Now, moving on to the whether ableism and sexism, the thematic topic of today's panel, I think both of them definitely have certain parallels, because they all too often involve the use of stereotypes that are harmful. They can be patronizing and disempowering. They occur at both individual and structural levels, both in the private and public spheres. They fail to take into account the specific needs of individuals, and they rest on unequal power dynamics and result in oppression. So I think there's a lot of commonality, and that really reflects the different dimensions of the intersectionality that we are talking about here. It may involve direct or indirect discrimination, and may be targeted at women as well, and especially when they're in cases of women with disabilities, they may be targeted because of that. So this is obviously something that all of you know, but I just wanted to sort of articulate this to make the point that there is a lot of overlap and there is a lot of common ground, and this is how these two areas are cross-cutting, and this is how we, the working group, have been looking at these issues. Now, for the working group, intersectional discrimination has meant that, and as you all know, that human rights violations are compounded, and the outcomes are exacerbated. And we've highlighted these in a number of our thematic reports. So the first one, for example, on political and public life, was one where we really highlighted, among other things, the lack of representation of all women in decision-making, the lack of parity, but also the lack of role models. So this also includes women with disabilities. The fact that there is an absence, there is a vacuum in key political spheres in public life means that there is an absence of an important voice. And so this is also something that states need to address. We have encouraged states to try and achieve parity in political decision-making and leadership, and also to recognize that there are historically marginalized women in leadership and decision-making positions. In our 2014 report on women in economic and social life, we focused on the impact of austerity measures on women in general, but we did also talk about women with disabilities. And more specifically, in connection with the discussion on women's care functions, the working group has called for a redistribution of care functions so that a disproportionate burden of unpaid care does not fall on women. And we've called for the provision by the state of affordable and accessible care facilities, as well as measures to reduce and redistribute unpaid care work for children and individuals with disabilities, and to make sure that unpaid care work factors in the calculation of gross national product. There is an androcentric bias in economic policy and economic systems that affects all women, but it clearly affects women with disabilities in very specific ways as well. And so we did bring women with disabilities into focus in that discussion. In our report on health and safety, we did highlight the all too common, what we refer to as instrumentalization of women's bodies for political purposes. This language has been somewhat controversial. The Human Rights Council continues to be so, even right now, as the latest resolution is being discussed. This is something that certain states have opposed, but we believe it's very important to acknowledge and to seek acknowledgement of the fact that there is instrumentalization. And in our health and safety report in 2016, we did dedicate a section in which we talked about the discrimination faced by women and girls with disabilities and the specific barriers they face in accessing healthcare. We've noted the specific issues resulting from denial of sexual and reproductive health services, and also the lack of autonomy, the denial of autonomy, which also results in violations. And we've also acknowledged the disproportionate risk of intimate partner violence. So I believe I just have a minute, but all of these reports are available online. I think the essence of what I would like to say is that we have, whenever possible, we've highlighted issues pertaining to women with disabilities and raised them in all of these thematic reports. One of the challenges that we face as special procedures is that the reports that we produce, there's a very tight word limit. So we're not able to put everything that we know and everything that we hear about in these reports. So I think it's very important for organizations and women's rights groups and other advocates to really think about what issues they want to raise with these special procedures, so that we can actually put something in the reports on the basis of which we can then build later on. And if we are informed about issues, we are able to apply that knowledge, not just in our thematic reports, but in, like I said, our communications and position papers, and also when we do our monitoring work as well. And we also do submit amicus briefs, and Stephanie mentioned the issue of Zika. We also submitted an amicus brief to the government of Brazil. So, these are the different ways in which we've highlighted a whole range of issues, but there's definitely more that can be done. So I'll stop there because I've run out of time, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both very much for a very interesting outline of your work and where you are coming from. And you've raised a lot of issues here that are so topical for us today. I'd like to start with a couple of very general questions before I get on to specific substantive issues. And the first one is about intersectionality itself as an approach. What do you see as the strengths of an intersectional approach to gender and disability? And are there particular challenges that you think exist for the two movements to try and work together? Are there things that unite the women's movement and the disability movement? Or are there things that, in some sense, divide them? And are there ways that you think that the movements could build on the kind of work that you have been doing to work even more closely together? So there's a lot of questions in there. So take your time and maybe consider how you feel about some of those particular points, which I think you have touched on already.
Yes, sure. I think that's sort of the key to the nature and the way that we work at Women Enabled International. We see women as having many facets to our lives, and as you said in your introduction, Lucy, of course, gender and disability are two dimensions, but there are many other dimensions as well, and those are really important for us to consider because those impact how these issues are resolved. One of the things that Melissa said that really highlighted to me is about the commonality between the women's movement and the disabled women's movement is the issue of instrumentalizing women's bodies, and both movements, I believe, have as a core principle autonomy and self-autonomy and decision-making about our lives and our bodies, and not wanting the state to tell us how to use our bodies and what to do with our bodies and what we can't do with our bodies. And so all the issues of objectification of women and women's bodies apply to women generally and to disabled women in particular. So I think it's very, very important to highlight that particular issue. There are challenges with bringing disabled women, or we as disabled women, going into the women's rights movement. Some parts of it are very, very welcoming. Other parts, not so much. I've discovered, it was really interesting, I was doing some work with a particular women's rights organization for a few years, and they didn't quite get disabled women's issues. And then as some of these women got older, they suddenly kind of got it because they became disabled women themselves. But that was one of the priorities, I think, was to try to bring those voices. And there have been other problems in women's movements in who they include, and there were periods where lesbian women were not as welcome in some portions of the women's rights movement as well. So some of this takes time, but I think it also requires that people have safe conversations between one another, so that there's no silly question, there's no useless question, so that if women's rights people and disabled women's rights people get together and maybe talk a little bit about the things that unite them, We all need health care. We all need sexual and reproductive health care. But also to talk about, honestly, the things that divide us, and perhaps with some of that kind of conversation, we can actually find that fewer and fewer things actually divide us and that we can work together. Melissa?
Sure. Thank you. I think this is a really critical question. Aside from being on the working group, I've spent many years as an activist. And right now I'm also with the Center for Women's Global Leadership, where I do a lot of advocacy. I think there are a couple of things that strike me. First of all, when we say the women's rights movement, there are so many movements within that movement. So I think it's really important for all of us, depending on what it is that I'm advocating for, what I'm working on, to really think about where I need to make the connections. We also live in a world where I think there's a lot that happens in academia, and then there's a lot that happens at the level of activism. So really thinking about how to build those bridges, and also across disciplines. Like, for example, right now, we're at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, I am focusing a lot on women in the world of work. This means I have had to work with feminist economists who are doing their own advocacy within the world of economists, but in order to advance women's rights in the world of work, I have had to sort of reach out to them and think of ways in which to work with them to identify common issues. So one common issue that we've identified is the issue of unpaid care work. So I think really thinking strategically also about areas, disciplines, different worlds within the larger world is very important. And then I think one more thing I'd like to say, there's a lot that could be said about this, and it is an important question, but I think women's rights activists, our history is one of really, it's one of struggle. It was only in the mid-1990s, I think 1993, where women's rights were formally recognized as human rights. This didn't happen when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. It's something that women from across the world fought for together. They were able to identify, after a lot of discussion and disagreements and conversations and engagement in different parts of the world between 1975 through 1993, they were able to agree on one unifying issue, and that was violence against women. And it was a result of all of that organizing, engaging, and activism that they were able to make sure that in Vienna, and we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Vienna Conference this year, actually next Monday, June 25th is the 25th anniversary. A lot of feminist activists who were part of that struggle during that time will say that that is the time that we were recognized as human for the first time. So I think it's really important for us to remember that these things are not going to come to us. Recognition, whether you're fighting for the rights specifically of women with disabilities, or even within that, I would assume that there are many different, areas, or many different subgroups perhaps. Maybe some of you are focusing on one particular set of issues or one particular type of disability. It's really important to remember that we have to be proactive, and each of one of us must we need to identify and prioritize, and we need to reach out. Speaking of movements, the Me Too movement, one of the criticisms of Me Too, on the one hand, I think it's sort of broken the silence around violence against women. It's encouraged many women to come forward and speak. But, I live in the United States, and one of the big critiques is that it's excluded women of color. In the US, I'm a woman of color. So, again, the point is that movements typically, I think, they don't naturally, organically evolve in a way to be inclusive of everyone, but it's really on us. And I know this is hard. Being a human rights advocate is not easy. It is actually quite draining. And that's why now there's a lot of talk about self-care as well, because there's a recognition that the work that we have chosen to do is not easy, and we have to fight at every step. But when we talk about the inclusiveness of movements, I think the question should be, how do we make our place in this movement? What are the steps that we need to take? And I think there is also a structural challenge, of course, resources. We need resources. We need resources to even meet like this. Without resources, without the university making this happen, we would be in the same room. The question of resources comes up at every step of the way. So, I mean, there must be some of us who are also engaging with people who have control over the resources as well, to influence that flow as well. So I think there are a number of fronts and a number of issues, a number of areas that we really need to look at when we talk about movements. But the question we need to ask ourselves is that what is it that we need to do to make sure that we are included? Or do we need to create a separate movement, but then build bridges strategically with other movements?
Thanks both. That's really interesting insights here, and a lot of food for thought for us there. Can I just touch on something else that you have both mentioned? You both obviously have a great deal of experience engaging with human rights bodies in particular, and in advocacy work in general. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the mechanisms that exist for vindicating the rights of women generally and women with disabilities, whether you'd like to say anything about those. I think that a very good point was made earlier about strengthening, I think you made it, Melissa, actually, about using the findings, for example, of one in relation to one particular human rights instrument to shore up arguments under another, and that is a very tactical thing to do. But are there other tactical things that we should be aware of in terms of human rights bodies, for example, or enforcement mechanisms generally, legal or otherwise? So maybe this time we could start with you, Melissa, and then we'll go to Stephanie. Is that all right? Or maybe you're tired of speaking at great length.
Unless people are tired of listening to my voice, I am okay. I think, again, a lot can be said, but one thing that, again, from my own experience, I think that's really important when you're engaging with treaty monitoring bodies, and something that I also had to do a lot myself, was to think very strategically about framing. Of course, there's obviously the CRPD, and there's obviously the Special Rapporteur on Persons with Disabilities, and there's CEDAW, which we are all accustomed to thinking about as we think about women in particular. But then first, there are all of these other bodies that are also responsible for the enforcement of human rights. And to the extent that if we are saying that disabilities is a cross-cutting issue, because every community, every country, everywhere we go, there are people with disabilities. So we need to look at all of these treaty monitoring bodies and say that our issues touch upon the work of all of these bodies. So we should not exclude any particular body. The question is, where do we find the hooks? Are there articles, are there general recommendations or concluding observations where we can find hooks and we can present the information? So I think thinking about all the treaty monitoring bodies, and honestly all 55 special procedures, because the whole Human Rights Council system of special procedures, special mandate holders are supposed to gender mainstream. They have an obligation to do that. It's not done systematically and across the board, and the extent to which they do it varies. But for example, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health just released his report that looks at deprivation of liberty, and he has 2 paragraphs in there that talk about women with disabilities and talks about the increasing population of women with disabilities in prisons. And he's noted that trend. So there's a hook there as well to think about, to utilize. So my point is, the Special Rapporteur on Poverty, the good thing is that there are special rapporteurs on so many different thematic issues. So I think thinking about how to engage with these different special rapporteurs, organizations like Women Enabled International have been doing that. Sadly, there aren't hundreds more of, organizations that have been able to establish a voice in these key political spaces. But I would say take a very broad look, and based on the issue that you're working on, the particular set of issues that you're working on, reach out to more than one. And I think the second point I'd like to make is regarding framing. And I saw this yield amazing results several years ago when I was at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and we filed a communication concerning a 17-year-old girl who was forced to continue a pregnancy to term after the fetus was diagnosed as anencephalic, which meant that there was no chance of survival after birth. There was a strong likelihood of the fetal demise even before the pregnancy came to term, and yet she was forced, this 17-year-old was forced to continue the pregnancy to term, only to see her child die within days, a few days. I mean, I think it was 48 hours or something of having given birth. So a communication was filed with the Human Rights Committee. We didn't go to CDL, we didn't go to the Children's Rights Committee, we went to the Human Rights Committee because we said that what happened to her, what she was subjected to, amounted to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And so I think, and that resulted in a view from the Human Rights Committee, which we now use in so many different court decisions. But the point is that that connection was made between denial of reproductive autonomy on a ground on which it was legal in that particular country and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And I would say that that was a great achievement. I mean, that's how we need to think about building norms. It's not just about, I think we shouldn't limit our own thinking. I think we need to be creative and think about how do we want to frame certain issues that really and truly shed light on the actual nature of the experience and what's most strategic, and then go to other bodies as well, not limit ourselves to just one or two of the ones that seem most obvious to us.
Really good point. Yeah.
Stephanie?
Yeah, that was absolutely true, and that is somewhat the way that we work as well, trying to find the niches within other treaty bodies where we can advocate for disabled women and girls on our issues. And I mean, I think that the example that you gave of the Center for Reproductive Rights case and the Human Rights Committee is an extremely important one. We've also advocated before the committee that enforces the Convention Against Torture, similarly around issues of forced non-consensual sterilization of disabled women and girls, so that it doesn't only need to be argued before the CRPD committee. And sometimes, as sad as it is to say, countries respond more strongly to pronouncements from some treaty bodies than they do from other treaty bodies. And also, not every government, take the United States, for example, has ratified the CRPD or the CEDAW for that matter. So if you're doing advocacy in the United States at this juncture, you don't have those treaty bodies to go to, so you have to be very creative on finding things in the few treaties that have been, in fact, ratified. Just on one of the things that Melissa talked about previously, about how women's rights were really not recognized at all in international human rights law until 1993. In Beijing, China, there was actually a rather large delegation of disabled women who came to Beijing and had very strong and powerful voices in those women's rights discussions. So that's a really important thing to remember. But as we briefly touched on the question of funding, there has been a bit of difficulty in getting funding for disabled women's rights from women's rights funders. That's beginning to change slightly. Women enabled can testify to that because we've been somewhat lucky or hardworking or pesty or whichever, and managed to get some of those funds. But it is very, very difficult to make that point. I was on a panel last week in New York, and one woman was telling me how she made up, she was a disabled women's rights advocate, and she was making a pitch to a women's rights funder, and she was talking about, this circumstance with disabled women, another circumstance with disabled girls, and just various issues that she was advocating on. And the funder said to her, Well, that's all very, very interesting, but when are you going to tell me something about women's rights issues? So, now that is a really bad example or powerful example, but it just sort of points out the struggle. How do we get disabled women's issues and the attention of funders on those issues? So we don't only need to advocate before treaty bodies, but we also need to do some advocacy with funders. And we have been doing that at Women Enabled International, not only for funding for our own work, but also for funding for our partners.
Well, thank you. That is some very interesting and strategic advice there, I think, that will be very useful. Can I just go to another topic that you have both mentioned and have both done some work on? And this is the issue of violence against women with disabilities. And of course, this is a repeated theme in the general comment on Article 6, for example. And the working group has done reports on this, and you've also advocated in this area, Stephanie. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit about the issue of violence against women with disabilities in particular. I mean, there's obviously the whole context of gender violence more broadly, but is there anything perhaps that you would like to highlight with regard to the specific problems that women with disabilities might face here, the barriers, for example, that they face maybe in making complaints, which might be even more difficult to surmount than the barriers for women generally. And if you have any thoughts on things that could be done to address this particular problem. So who would like to go first? Stephanie is going to go.
So back a few years ago, I met for the first time Rashida Manjoo, who was then the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And actually, she was visiting the US, doing a country visit, and I offered to hold a reception in her honor to invite women's rights activists to my home. So I gave her a glass of wine. Actually, she didn't drink wine, but nonetheless, she was in a somewhat vulnerable mood. So I said, Rashida, why don't we do a report on violence against women and girls with disabilities? That would be really important. And she actually agreed if my colleague Hope Lewis, sadly deceased now, but if she and I, if Hope and I would work to help her to do this report. And thus she issued the first report on violence against women and girls with disabilities, which I think has had a really powerful impact. And she did point out a number of really important factors. Yes, women with disabilities experience many of the same forms of violence as all women experience, but it also has unique forms, unique causes, and unique consequences. Just two issues to highlight. We all know that we should know that there are unfortunately very limited shelters for women trying to flee violence. But especially in some parts of the world, they hardly exist at all. But even in the countries where they exist, even in the so-called developed world, very few shelters are accessible to women with disabilities or women who have children with disabilities and need to escape violence. So if the one place that's supposed to be your safety net, either you can't get in or we don't take care of people like you, or whatever attitude might be held, there's a barrier. The other really severe barrier is, in fact, in accessing justice. Many court systems view disabled women as per se incompetent, uncredible witnesses. So if you encounter that barrier even at the police station when you attempt to report violence, then how can you possibly vindicate your rights? And then, of course, like all women, sometimes disabled women are somewhat dependent on male partners, but if your male partner is also your caregiver, not only economic support, as many women experience in attempting to escape violence, but if your partner is your caregiver and one of the forms of violence is taking away accessibility aids, as Lucy was mentioning before, or just refusing to, hiding your wheelchair so you can't even leave the house so there are many just unique factors to consider when we're talking about violence against women with disabilities.
I totally agree with everything that's been said. So I don't have a whole lot to add except for the fact that, the working group has also, in its report on health and safety, acknowledged the higher incidence of intimate partner violence among women with disabilities because of gender and disability. In both of these dynamics sort of coming into play. But there's a struggle at the Human Rights Council. There is, and this happens every year, it's reflected in resolutions, and especially the dialogue around the whole issue of equality within the family. I think we know that a lot of violence against women generally, and especially also against women and girls with disabilities, begins at home. And this is why it is so important for equality within the family to be a common issue of concern. So again, thinking from a more strategic and tactical perspective, if this is something that, say for example, organizations advocating for the rights of women with disabilities feel strongly about, and then we are struggling at the Human Rights Council fighting for equality within the family, this is a thematic issue around which all of our voices need to come together, and they need to be expressed and they need to be heard. And then, of course, the lack of access to justice or additional barriers, again, that's another thematic issue. And really thinking about how we can organize and join our voices, whether it be in the context of conversations about the SDGs right now, because there's a lot of work happening in connection with the SDGs. There's also a high-level working group that's been created within the UN system. It's not a formal, treaty body or Human Rights Council body, but around access to justice. So just finding some of these thematic hooks, I think, can be very important, where you can also bring your voices. And there's a lot of emphasis on individual stories and experiences, and I think that's very important as a human rights advocate, someone who's done fact-finding, gone on missions and documented those. That's very important. But I think we need to also think beyond stories to very tactical sort of communication strategies. And, again, who do we join forces with and who do we join our voices with? I think that is also very important. Because, we need stories to sort of speak to the hearts and minds of people. But at the end of the day, if there's one thing that I've learned from my own activism is that we need political power. Just having knowledge and being on the right side of the law is not enough. But what do we need to do to gain political power, visibility, and presence? I think that is something that we all need to think very hard about.
Okay, that is very, very useful advice again. I've been advised that we will need to open up to the floor, so I'm just going to give one more question to our two discussants here. And I'm torn as to which one, because I had a few that I was actually dying to ask you about. But maybe some people will pick up on some of the other issues that we won't get to, unfortunately, today. So I just thought to finish up, again, because it's been a feature of both your own work, and particularly yours, Melissa, and it's also such a strong theme within the general comment on Article 6, is the issue of healthcare and reproductive rights for women generally, but particularly for women with disabilities. And it's something that has, I think, come out in both of your discussion here. So can I just ask you to speak briefly and generally about your experience in that particular area, as the commonalities that might be useful to build on for the two movements, and any particular strategies, again, because I think what we're getting a lot out of in this session is good strategic thinking for how things can be put forward. So particular strategies for advocating or developing reproductive rights and choices and autonomy for women generally, and particularly women with disabilities. And Melissa, perhaps we'll start with you, or with Stephanie this time.
Would you like to go first?
Okay. You.
Oh, okay. I guess the working group has talked about the whole issue of women's autonomy, and we also did a position paper on sexual and reproductive health and rights with a focus on women's autonomy. And the position that the working group has taken is essentially that anything that denies women full autonomy and agency is discriminatory, inherently discriminatory and unacceptable. In our position paper, we've also cross-referenced the work of the CRPD, where a similar position has been taken. Something I think it's really important. For me as an activist, as a matter of principle, I feel like, the moment that women are denied their autonomy and agency is when they're denied equal dignity, and that's the moment when they cease to be human. There are a lot of problems in the world where, one that I've had to grapple with a lot is because I'm South Asian, I come from South Asia, so the issue of sex-selective abortion tends to come up a lot. And, there are people with different views, but, one viewpoint is that, yes, of course, son preference is a terrible thing, and the use of sex-selective abortion in pursuit of son preference is not acceptable. But then the answer to that is not to limit women's autonomy and agency and health and jeopardize their health and their dignity, but it's really to address all the causes that contribute to that and create a world where women, girls, are treated with equal respect and dignity. So it's more a question of, the approach, and I think an approach that respects women's autonomy and agency and dignity is absolutely critical, and that is consistent with the working group, with the CRPD, and with the work of some of the other human rights bodies as well. Although there's also language in international human rights law that would, for example, when sex-selective abortion is described as a form of violence against women, that does raise the whole issue of fetal rights. And then that's when I think we really need to ask ourselves, and again, go back to human rights law. Human rights accrue at birth. There are fetal interests that need to be protected, but then the bottom line is that human rights do accrue at birth. So I think we need to sort of find positions that are principled. We cannot have a double standard and say in one situation it's okay to deny autonomy, in another they must have full autonomy, if it's abortion or sterilization, etc. So I think that's where a bit of the struggle lies. But I think when we talk about sexual and reproductive rights, that obviously is something that does come up.
Give the last word to this one to Stephanie.
Okay. Well, the last word, I don't think there'll be a last word on this conversation. And actually, stay tuned tomorrow afternoon for our panel where we're going to be discussing abortion and disability issues. Women Enabled International has been trying to do, we're in the process of doing, we're not trying, we're actually doing, some consultations with disabled women from different parts of the world. Because very often on the whole issue of abortion and disability, which I think is kind of the crux of the sexual reproductive health problem here, the voices of disabled women are very rarely heard in these debates. And many women with disabilities have been very strong reproductive rights advocates. But what was interesting to me was a number of women have said to us in these conversations, these consultations that we're having, that, for them, abortion isn't the top priority, not because they want to surrender their right to make that decision, but their concern is like basic health care. They often don't even have access to basic health care, including basic sexual and reproductive health care, including the right to abortion. And I think when we look at this issue, to me, I totally agree with what Melissa was saying about the issue of autonomy. If you deny one person her autonomy, then you're denying yourself your autonomy, or at least you're sanctioning the right to deny your own, for the state to deny your autonomy. And I think one of the important points that's often not discussed in the issue of abortion and disability issues is the obligation of the state to address, both in terms of from both conventions like CDAW and the CRPD, is to eliminate stereotyping and stigma by education. Not only education of the community, but also education of doctors and healthcare providers, et cetera. So, which influences the decisions that women make in the course of their pregnancy. So that's a really important, very, very important component of this conversation. But stay tuned tomorrow afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, but we're going to open it up to the floor. This particular topic is obviously incredibly topical here in Ireland and obviously Argentina at the moment. And I suppose just to say, one of the campaign that led the reform of the 8th Amendment here in Ireland was called the Together for Yes campaign. And the whole idea was to bring in as many groups as possible, including women with disabilities, including transgendered women, including LGBT communities. So that was the very essence of the campaign, is that we were together to campaign for yes. So it is incredibly topical, this issue, and we look forward to the debate tomorrow. So I'm going to open it up to the floor and take some questions.